All right, everyone, happy Monday. Today we're revealing the truth about overhead press. Oh no, the truth. Oh no. So before we get to our back and chest workout today, which I'm filming the whole thing, commentary, all that stuff at the gym, we're gonna answer this question of, does overhead press train the middle delts? Oh no, because the answer is yes and no, kinda, sorta. Let's figure out why. By the way, context for this, someone asked this as a question in the last video. Super in depth, whoever you are, thank you for the question. Thank you for taking the time to be thoughtful. If you're thoughtful with your questions, and I do end up seeing it on a past video, I can answer it in the intro of a future video like I'm doing now. Okay, so we'll cover overhead press, we'll cover Arnold press as well. So first thing we need to ask is, what is the position that we're in? Boom. Well, if we're doing an overhead press, here is the position. So very simply, we are putting our arms into external rotation. That's what this is called. And then we are pushing upward against something, much like if we were pulling downward against something and we were in external rotation, right? The same thing would be true. All we're doing is we're just reversing the load direction. So it's like a pull down, but in reverse. Cool. What does that mean? Well, that means basically that if the arm is moving this way, then anything that is on the top side of this joint, the shoulder joint, anything that is on the top is going to be able to move the arm up. Why? Because the resistance is pushing the arm down. So much in the same way that when you do a biceps curl, the load is basically opening the front side of the joint and the biceps closes the front side of the joint. So the load of an overhead press is essentially opening the top side of this joint, and then the stuff on top basically closes that gap. That's how all muscle contraction works. That's how torque in the body works, and that's how we load and target muscles. Cool. So in the context of middle delt, well, what's going on with the middle delt? Well, consider this. If you're doing a normal, quote unquote, normal lateral raise, you're just flapping your arm outward like this. Why is that an exercise that trains the middle delt? Well, because if you think about where the middle delt attaches from this bony arch called the acromion, it runs from here, this all along this border, and it goes woo, boop, down to the arm. And so what that means is it goes like this, and when it contracts, it pulls these 2 points together, and when it pulls these 2 points together, it raises the arm. Well, how can it do that? Well, because when the arm is in this sort of neutral position at the side delt sits perfectly on the side, so it closes that gap. But what happens when we are not just in this neutral position, arm at side, but rather we externally rotate? Ooh, what happens? Well, if the side delts attachment was on the side before, but now I externally rotate, where is the side delts attachment? It's now sort of rolled backward, right, toward the back side of the joint. So again, so here's my side delt, boop, it's going down right here. If I externally rotate, you'll see how my finger is moving backward on this bone, right? It's not actually moving anywhere, but relative to the starting position, it rolls backward. So what does that mean for the side delt? Well, if the side delt rolls backward, what it will really want to do is, because it is now on the back side of the joint, i.e. I've rolled it backward, not physically, but just in a relative sense, what that essentially means is that where initially the side delt was represented in green here, it could just pull up like this. Because this attachment site rolls to the back, well, now all of a sudden the side delt actually has an ability to pull back. Why? Because it's on the back side of the joint, okay? So this is why, for example, if you got into like a reverse fly machine, or even, you were doing like a cable reverse fly, and you go like this, you externally rotate your arms and you move your arm backward, that's gonna involve a ton of middle delts. Why is that the case? Because of what we just explained. So in the context of an overhead press, you go to external rotation, you press vertically, all the stuff that sits basically on the top side of the shoulder will be able to pull it upward. So if I roll this thing backward and the middle delt rolls backward with the bone, well, what's on the top side? The top side is now basically fully controlled by the front delt. Because think about, for the same reason that the middle delt just got scooted sort of backward in this context, for the same reason that happens, well, the front delt, because it attaches more on the front, actually rolls so that when you're in this position, it's now on the top. In other words, it now becomes that string that's able to bridge this gap, okay? So put very simply, a traditional overhead press will bias much more of the front delts compared to the middle delts. Do the middle delts contract at all? Yes, they play a small stabilizing role. They basically prevent the arm from falling forward. They can also, if you consider sort of what happens when you move in this direction, they could manage some degree of internal rotation, just given how the fibers are kind of twisting. But the summary is basically this. When you imagine this is the middle delt attachment, when you roll the middle delt attachment backward as you perform or before you perform the overhead press, that will basically move it out of the immediate direction you are pushing. Now, is it the case that if you roll your arm backward, your middle delt may still be able to contribute to some of the vertical motion? Yes, as long as it stays above the joint axis of the shoulder. So what does that mean? In simpler terms, hopefully you can see this, yep. So if the arm is here, okay, right, and you picture, okay, someone is moving like this, where is the joint axis? Well, the joint axis essentially is an imaginary line going boop right through here. So if I put my finger right here, hopefully you all can see, finger right here, everything that is above this point is capable of pulling the arm upward, which is why, for example, if you look at a muscle like the rear delts, right, which may be sweeping underneath of this bone, that's why a muscle like the rear delts pulls the arm down. That's why a muscle like the lats that run like this pulls the arm down. That's why the lats don't press upward. They pull downward because they're below the axis, okay? So if the axis of motion is right here, everything on the top can actually contribute. So what happens when you move the arm backward like this is, does the middle delt stay on top of the joint axis? Yes, technically it does, but what happens is because it's now rolled backward, it also has this capacity to pull backward because now again, it's not just on the top, it's not just closing this gap, it's also closing a gap that's now behind the joint, like this, okay? So in short, what happens when you externally rotate is basically that you move the middle delt, at least in part, out of the plane of motion is what we would call it, that the overhead press actually functions in. Now, what about something like an Arnold press? Some people do some odd variations. There was, I believe this guy who was the first one to actually do the Arnold press before Arnold. This is something that I saw in a GVS video, which someone in the last comment section linked, where basically people were kind of doing like a weird thing like this, right? Where they were kind of flapping their arms upward instead of just pressing like this. They were almost doing this like flap, this internal rotation flap. So what does the internal rotation thing do, right? Yeah, it involves more side delt. Why does it involve more side delt? Because it's more like a lateral raise. Like if you basically just cut off someone's forearm and you watch what was happening in the context of this kind of a press, right? Basically what people are doing is they're just externally rotating less. They're losing the external rotation so that they can basically just perform this motion of the arm. And what is this motion of the arm? This motion of the arm, like in this direction, is basically just a lateral raise with a confusing forearm component, right? So whether I do this or if I just keep my elbow straight, right, that's just a lateral raise motion. So in summary, when we perform an overhead press, okay, the front delt moves on the top side of this joint. The middle delt starts to move behind the joint. So although part of the middle delt will be able to pull slightly upward, it is mostly pulling the arm sort of in a backward direction because those fibers basically move in line with the joint. And when they move in line with the joint, they start to pull it in this direction, which again, any of you just freaking do this, just test this. You don't even have to believe me on any evidence other than your own experience of just what happens if you do a reverse fly with your arms in external rotation. So put your arms in external rotation like you're gonna do an overhead press, and then basically put a load, either in your hand or just wrap it around here and go like this. What you will feel is your middle delts, which by definition, again, in this position will pull you backward. And if you're trying to do some kind of overhead press for primarily front delts and middle delts as a sort of stabilizer, great, fantastic. Some people, given the genetics, given their, potentially the amount of drugs that they take, they can do an overhead press and see middle delt growth because yes, the middle delt will contract. It's not going to be the most directly involved thing. I would call it a stabilizer in the context of an overhead press. Again, because it's basically just managing the upper arm position, but it's not actually pressing against the load. The thing that is pressing against the load are the front delts, and if you're using a fixed bar, the triceps, and obviously all these muscles here like the traps, the muscles that upwardly rotate essentially, the traps mostly because they also elevate, and so when you're pressing something upward, the traps will be involved to a significant degree. So in any case, I hope that makes sense. That's my take. Basically, in short, is if I'm doing a middle delt exercise, am I ever picking an overhead press? No. If someone is doing overhead presses and they're doing a lot of overhead presses and they're doing a lot of other movements, like maybe they're doing rows and reverse flies and pull downs, right? there may be enough middle delt sprinkled into all of that stuff that they look at their program and they're like, oh, I don't need lateral raises, right? Given the results that they see. But there are many people who do just that, myself included, whose middle delts, just for whatever combination of reasons, structure or otherwise, like the techniques that I was using, the exercises that I was doing, until I really started to just spam actual lateral raises, my middle delts wouldn't grow. So if you're someone who is not, genetically inclined, we'll say, in that sort of a way, where your middle delts just come along for the ride with your presses and your pulls, again, because they are involved as stabilizers in these kinds of motions, and they do potentially contribute significantly more in, I gave the example of the reverse fly and external rotation. So if you're doing a lot of different kinds of exercises that all have a little bit of middle delt sort of overlapping with those, and again, you have the genetics to grow from those exercises, given your structure and given the techniques that you're using, great, I'm very happy for you. But a vast majority of you, I would highly advise, even if you're that person, by the way, who sees the results, if you want to do something that's like maximal middle delt, like I want to do something right now, dude, that's like, I'm just going to slam my middle delt. It's not going to be an overhead press. It's not going to be a pull down. It's not going to be a reverse fly, at least the way they're traditionally done. It's going to be something more like a freaking normal lateral raise. So long-winded way of saying, do your lateral raises for your middle delts. That will not be a surprise to many of you, but I hope that the overall breakdown in terms of the explanation of the overhead press thing makes sense. Again, it's all just about discovering what is the joint axis of this motion and what is the relationship to that joint axis, or what is the relationship rather between that joint axis and the surrounding muscles and how they're actually acting on those bones relative to the load, right? So for example, we're talking about overhead press, but all of a sudden, if the load direction changes so that now I'm doing a pull down in this position, everything changes. Why? Because the load direction and the torque demand as a consequence of that also changed. So if you want to really understand all this stuff, I have an upcoming manual. I'll link it. I'll put a little boop thing there below if you're interested in learning more about the principles that underlie all this stuff. But anyway, if you're not, we will get to the workout now. I'm doing back and chest today. As always, I will talk through my stuff as I'm going through the workout, so I hope you all enjoy that. All right, people. Starting off today with a machine chest supported row. I feel like if you had a gun to my head, right, and you were like, Ben, you only get one back movement for the rest of time, what could it be, Ben? I would probably say this kind of exercise, because this is like a back variation that will hit pretty much 100% of your back in terms of the pulling tissues, right? You got your traps, you got your rhomboids, you got your rear delts, and you even got your lats. Even if you do this with a wider arm path, when you get into that stretch position, because your lats basically hold your shoulder girdle to your body, they're going to prevent your shoulders from flying off of your body. So, humongous fan of this as an overall back smasher. The way that I'm doing it is more of a upper back focus way to do it. So, grip is wider and angle is fairly horizontal. And the way that I like to do this, as with all other variations, for any of you who are new here, is I just go until I can't. And I generally pick a weight that I can do for between 5 and maybe 15 reps on average. So what you saw right there was the entire warm-up, yes. You may be surprised by that. But that was literally the first thing I did, is I just put a plate on and I started pulling, and I think that's the ideal warm-up. Stop futzing around, wasting your time with your warm-ups. Just fucking put some load on the exercises you're going to do and start doing them. And if you can't do that, guess what? You need to pick better exercises. So first set here, we'll do 2 sets. Okay. Oh, oh God. So a lot of people will stop when their arms can't keep moving backward, but the problem with that is that you have so much more room to fatigue the target tissues all the way up until the point where you can't even move your shoulder blades back. So if your goals are like mid upper back with this thing, just go until you can't. Big mistake here, by the way, is just not paying attention to the fact that your chest should stay on the pad. A lot of people end up arching off of it, which is fine if your goals are related to targeting your erectors. But if you really want your traps, some of your upper lats, your rear delts, your rhomboids, you want those things doing the work, keep your freaking chest glued to the pad, keep it static the whole time, and just move your arms and your shoulder blades around the pad. Don't slump and arch, because that's just going to bring in some stuff that we don't want, at least with this variation and with this goal. All right, so forgot to mention that in terms of the session structure here, I also do calves on my first upper body day of the week. Why? Because it's convenient. And I'm not always at this gym, but I typically am on this day. And I like to really use a seated straight knee calf machine. Very rare to find one that's like this, that's super, super good, in my opinion. So, yeah, straight knee calves. I'm going to do about total of maybe 4 sets here. I don't take that much rest, maybe 90 seconds between sets. Again, quick warm up. What you just saw was basically the warm up because I kind of know the deal in terms of the weights that I'm using here. But I'll do 4 sets here, and then I will move on to chest, and then I will also hit some kind of seated calf raise, which God forbid I do a seated calf raise right later on in the session. So today is technically back, chest, and calves, and I am doing 3 back, 2 chest, 2 calves. Some people say that's too much. Some people say that's too little. Regardless of who you talk to on the internet, you will be losing with someone. So anyway, I mentioned this with other calf exercises, but the biggest thing you want to keep in mind with the straight knee stuff is keep the knee fucking straight. Because a lot of people end up just basically turning this into like a partial leg extension. So you really want to make sure you're focused on moving the heel, not really moving the knees. So I don't know if it's hard to tell, but the unique thing about this kind of seated calf machine is that this foot plate, so watch the foot plate and watch the direction of my foot. The foot plate actually arches my foot, so it tips like this, and then like this, and then back that way, right? So when you have a calf machine that does this, you're basically removing at least a lot of the potential for foot involvement, because unlike a surface that doesn't move, i.e., like you imagine doing a standing calf raise on something like a hack squat, or just a standing raise under a barbell or under a Smith machine, right? Anything where you're just no more grabbing the floor.
your foot basically has to constantly be changing position. So imagine you're doing a calf raise where you're doing this, like your toes basically have to bend and extend around the static foot plate. But when the foot plate actually arcs with your foot, it matches basically how the ankle moves. And basically what that does in short is it makes it so that your foot, the joints in your foot don't actually have to move. They just have to be able to stabilize the load. Whereas with something like a leg press calf raise, for example, your toes have to constantly be moving to accommodate the fact that the foot plate isn't moving with your ankle. So in summary, if you can access a calf machine like this, in most cases it'll feel at least a little bit more intuitive to coordinate. And for those of you who have foot problems, especially, that is something that can be of a huge, huge help. So if you're struggling with calves and you have a machine like this, try to find it. It can take a little while to find, especially on this kind of machine, the right, settings for your anatomy and how you like your knees to be, right? Because bending your knees will change how far forward or backward your foot is. So will straightening your knees. So will sitting more forward in the seat and backward in the seat. So just, I would recommend as a starting point, shove your low back into the seat, get your knee as relatively straight as is comfortable, and then just try to isolate the calf motion. And, again, when your foot moves with the foot plate in there, sort of orientation type way, it's a lot easier, in my opinion, to really just isolate the calves. And then once you have that skill, you can basically apply it across any sort of other variation of the calf raise exercise, regardless of the foot plate. Now, some of you may have no issues whatsoever with that kind of thing, but just thought it was worth mentioning as another consideration for those of you who maybe have a lot of machine access, but you're not really sure like what machines are best suited to this kind of thing. So I prefer this for the straight knee variation when I can. All right, people, very exciting day today because I am going to do dumbbell press and I'm going to do it at a 10-degree incline because I don't love the flat angle. It's just a little bit precarious with the whole setup thing where you kick the dumbbells back, you might basically just ruin your life falling backward. So I'm doing this mostly for fun because I typically will do a machine chest press for chest to start out. But because you all are watching, I want to do something fun. I want to do something slightly different. And I want to just also do a little test of my dumbbell press strength because I don't often do them. And that could be fun as well. So these are these 70s. And that was my first warm up. For today, I want to test my strength with the hundreds. I just want to be like, hey, how many freaking repetitions can I get with the 100-pound dumbbells at a 10-degree incline with a slight arch in my back? For those of you who are curious, my goals with this basically, full pec blast. I do something slightly more specific for, lower chest on my second press day, or my second chest day rather. So this is kind of like a middle chest dominated press based on the way that I have it set up. So anyway, what I'm going to do, because I just pressed the 70s for one set, and these are the hundreds here, I think I might just go right into the hundreds. That'll probably be a bad idea, but, why not live on the edge a little bit here? So, no idea how many reps I could get. I might get 3. I might get 7. I might get 5. I might get 20, though that's probably not going to happen, given I don't know if I've ever done 20 with the hundreds. So, anyway, first set, do I advise most people do that kind of thing? No, but let's just see how it goes. Okay. Okay. That was pretty good. Better than expected. So, for those of you wondering, in relation to the biomechanics of this kind of the press, if I'm arched, right, a little bit at this angle, the loading angle is probably like right here, right? So this kind of angle, solid for the upper chest, solid for the middle chest. The lower chest would be better suited for some more kind of decline thing. But still, because of the fact that those pecs are like a cable that wraps around the pulley of the rib cage, all the pecs are going to be able to push forward. Obviously, some front delts. Triceps are fairly minimal in the context of a dumbbell press, at least done this way. So overall, kind of predominantly a middle-ish pec movement with a sprinkle of upper, I would say, up there as well, a sprinkle of lower, but more upper chest than lower chest relative to this setup. So that was set one. I will do one more set. I will probably drop it to the 90s just to slow it down a little bit and not try to stroke my ego too much. Similar technique. And then we'll move on to our lat focused exercise for the day. All right, everyone, so we're moving on to our vertical pull, and I'll show this from different angles, but I'm in a machine basically that is pin loaded, single arm, pull down, and a couple things to keep in mind with execution here. My goals are lower lat focus, which basically means I want to be doing something that's really predominantly vertical. The thing about these types of machines, it's not good or bad. It just is a thing, and it's whether it's good or bad depending on context. The thing about these machines is that they arc, right? So I just drop the load here. And what that essentially means is that through a certain portion of the range, they're going to be moving upward and downward like this, predominantly. Okay, you can see this kind of just moving with my arm. But at a certain point, they're going to start to arc backward, right? So this is the beauty of a machine like this, is that it can train more of the total range, but essentially you're training slightly different things depending on which part of the arc you're using. So if I'm using this vertical part of the arc, I'm training more of the stuff that pulls vertically, like my lower lats, for example, which is the target here. But if I pull all the way backward into this part of the arc, well, now this is basically more of a row. So it's like pull down into row. If you're going to do the whole thing, fantastic. Just know that it's going to be a hybrid of different muscles. And what I'm basically doing with this activity is I'm not trying to do a total back or total lat thing. I'm trying to do mostly a vertical lat thing. So I say kind of in the top portion of this range, what I want to do, the vertical lat type of thing. And so as a consequence of that, this may look like, oh, Ben is just ego lifting because he's using only a part of the range. And I'm like, no, dude, I'm just being specific, okay? Also, opposite hand, I like to be braced against the other side of the machine. Again, I will reiterate, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing the quote unquote full range here. It's just that my goals with this particular movement and how it fits into my program, I want to do that kind of mostly vertical thing.
I like this. What? You know? You like the hate? You like it hot? Lord, huh? Oh, okay. Yeah, master.
So, big part of the reason here that the opposite hand is so relevant is because you see that this handle is actually pulling me up and across. So part of it wants to kind of pull me upward, but that's why we have the knee support. The other part of it wants to pull you across, so you use this opposite hand support. You could, of course, use this machine 2 arms at the same time, nothing wrong with that. But as with all single arm pulling stuff, you ideally want to be able to use your same side leg for support. Right? So if it's a pull down, same side leg either supported by a thigh pad or you just pushing into the floor, if it's like a row. And then ideally opposite hand can either help stabilize your trunk laterally in the case of a pull down, or you could push it forward against something in the case of a row. All right, so here we have Benception because we're filming into an air from a machine. So full disclosure, this is the first time I've used this chest fly machine. So I might not really know what setup is appropriate for me, which may be helpful for those of you watching to learn a thing or two about like how to troubleshoot in terms of setup. So the first thing that I did is start from the goal backwards. So like if I want this to kind of just be like me squeezing my arms together thing, generalized pec thing, but more of a middle upper pec focus. Again, that's more important to me as kind of with the first press. So if you know that that sort of arm path is your endpoint, you want to start by setting the seat in reverse from that. So if my arms are going to go here, I want the seat to be at a position where when I move my hands outward, boom, you all see how my hands are right in line with those lower handles. So given that that is, ooh, that feels good. Oh my God. Given that that is sort of where the handles naturally were when I sat here, I'll just kind of stay there. A couple things to keep in mind about upper versus lower chest. Very simply, if you want more lower chest, just arch your back more, right? So that your hands will end up here. If you want more upper chest, sit more upright, end up so that your biceps are kind of driving toward your collarbones. I'm kind of looking for something that's right smack in the middle of those things. Again, to kind of use a blended motion. And that first set felt really good, just as a warm-up set. So we're just gonna go into it now. Also, another big thing to keep in mind with chest flies, I think a slight elbow bend is probably appropriate in most cases, even though some people will say, no, you must straighten your elbows toward the end of the range or else. I think that's garbage. Well, not garbage, but just not a universal. So yeah, what I mean by that is you do not have to get to this position with your elbows straight. You can keep your elbows bent because all we ultimately care about is driving this thing inward. So if keeping your elbows bent feels better on your shoulders, is this to this really going to be the difference between making chest gains and not? Making chest gains and not? Obviously not. Or I hope that's obvious. Because a lot of people will see those sorts of minor changes and then have a panic attack about the technique. So yeah, that felt good. Probably do one more set here. So some of you may have noticed in the context of the fly that I just did that I wasn't pulling my arm off my body so far backward that my arms basically move past my torso very much, if at all. And the reason that's the case is because there's a certain point at which your upper arm stops moving backward, but at which your shoulder blade can basically squeeze backward. When you're trying to target the upper chest, you should know that your upper chest, it doesn't lengthen. If I move my shoulder blade like this, my upper chest isn't lengthening or shortening because my upper chest attaches from my collarbone to my upper arm. So in essence, what that means is that the only way that it can lengthen or shorten is if I move my arm. If I just squeeze my shoulder blade back, my collarbone and my upper arm are moving together, so there's no length change. So when you're doing an upper chest thing, you don't have to worry about dragging your arms really far back behind your body. You just have to get your arm back as far as it goes, and then you don't need that shoulder blade motion. So that's why more range isn't necessarily better. It just depends on what your goals are and what the context for the motion actually is. If I were doing a fly where I wanted to target more of my total chest as compared to just my upper chest more predominantly, then I would want to bring my arm farther back. I would want to squeeze my shoulder blade all the way back. But since that wasn't part of the goal, I didn't do that. So anyway, just pay attention to context and goal before you judge a motion. In terms of the technique, you need to know what is it for. Anyway, speaking to what is it for, this is basically just a narrow row. It's my last pull of the day because it's kind of a narrow row. The main bias will be my upper lats. So upper lats, really, really good at pulling the arm tight to the body in a rowing context as compared to the vertical lats, which we trained more so first, which pull more vertically. So this stack is not super heavy, so I can get a bunch of reps here. So speaking to the whole concept of more range isn't necessarily better, I could set this up and I could essentially keep pulling behind my body, but my lats don't pull my arm behind my body. They basically pull my arm directly to my side. So you'll notice a couple things. I'm really just pulling to this point, and then much in the same way that I do every other pulling motion, I just basically allow the range to drop as fatigue accumulates, and then finish it off with just a little bit of shoulder blade motion if I can, because those lats are going to be really, really good at moving the shoulder blades. So you don't want to miss out on that portion of the range if you're really trying to maximize, targeting the specific upper lats in this case, or the lower lats in the case of a pull down, like how you finish with sort of just shoulder blade motion. If I wanted a more sort of quote unquote complete back movement, if I wanted to blend a few goals, I would just pull farther. It would lighten the load a little bit, most likely. The other thing you'll notice about this is I am not actively arching my back, because if my hands are here and I arch my back, it's the same thing as doing a row that starts from here to here and making it go from lower as a starting point upward. But something that's more low to high would be more upper back. Something that's kind of more like this, where I'm driving the arms down, more lats. So I like to kind of almost relax into the pad a little bit, almost slump into it, because basically what that's going to do is it's going to change the angle from more pure horizontal to something that's actually more kind of like a slightly high to low thing. And then also just because, we're pulling in a forward to backward direction, there will be some rhomboids and some traps involved to a slight degree, in the same way that there's some rear delts involved here, but much less so compared to the first row we did, which was wider, much more shoulder blade up and back movement, a little bit more of an arch in the posture. And that's because I wanted to make that more of a slightly low to high thing. So anyway, I hope some of that was valuable. Something a lot of people do here too is when they have their feet here, they oftentimes will push significantly with their feet, which is basically just pushing them off the pad. So if you're using the full stack or something, you do want your feet here to help you a little bit, but you don't want to push so hard with your feet that you start to peel off of this chest supported pad, because that's just going to defeat the purpose of the chest support altogether. The purpose of the chest support is to limit the erector recruitment. So if you're pushing yourself off of it, then your erectors are going to have to start to pick up some slack. So if you're using your feet, be cautious about how much you use your feet. Since I've trained a lot of like absolute beginners who are barely using any load relative to their body weight, you might even actually want to put someone's feet behind them like this so that they can actually push themselves into the chest support to keep them glued there. So fun to kind of see how ultimately the principles are all the same, but how they can apply really differently and almost oppositely, right? So whereas I need a little bit of help to prevent myself from suffocating, someone else might actually need to actively use their legs to drive themselves into the pad, depending on how much load they're using. All right, folks, we got our 3 back movements out of the way. We got our 2 chest movements out of the way. We are finishing off with seated calf raises, which again, despite what Mike Israel and the rest of the so-called science-based people will tell you, these are still a fantastic movement to train your calves, and they always will be. So one thing I wanted to just comment on as I do these, because calf raises are really boring, is when I'm thinking about structuring a full back session like this, again, where back is really the priority, I'm thinking about how do I check a few boxes. Number one is how do I check the box of an upper back dominant movement, i.e. the first variation we did? How do I check the box of a vertical lat focus movement, which is the second pull we did? And then how do I check the box of a horizontal lat movement, i.e. something basically kind of in between those first two things? And so when I'm thinking about that in the context of any back day, what that really translates to is some kind of row that's slightly low to high, and that involves a little bit of retraction, shrugging type stuff. And then for the lats, some kind of vertical pull that's truly vertical, and some kind of horizontal pull that's kind of narrow. Oh God, this hurts a lot. I don't know how many reps I've done. Okay. So, in simple terms, we're thinking about something that's here, something that's here, and then something that's here. And I think if you just have 3 of those movements that you really freaking love and that you just spam to death, seems like a recipe for success when it comes to back training. To lay out something similar for chest, the way I view it is basically you want something that's kind of decline, something that's kind of in the middle to lower, and then something that's kind of above that point. So today I really just decided I wanted to do more 2 upper chest focus movements. Why did I decide to do that? Well, I was itching to do that dumbbell press to see how many I could get for fun, which I think takes the priority over the nerdy specifics, in my opinion, at least at this point in my life, in my career, if we'll call it that. But also just like, I know that I have a second chest day. And so if you have to make adjustments on the fly, whether it be because of something like objective and practical, or something that's more like rooted in something I did earlier, which is just like, hey, fuck it, I want to have some fun, then you know that like you have a whole nother day during the week to actually accomplish the entire goal that you set out to, that, within the context of a week. So you don't need to really like think that you need to get everything done in the day or in a single day, which is why twice a week frequency I think is really great, because especially if you're someone who has to travel a lot, change gym, it's nice to just think in terms of principle and not in terms of specific movement, because when you can think in terms of the principles, then you don't get sort of caught up in a bunch of silly questions like, do I have to do it this way or do I have to do it this way? You can just kind of reverse engineer from any goal that you have on any given day, regardless of where you are or what comes up. God. Okay. All right, everyone. So we're finishing off with. I know I said we were done with back, but I want to do one more pull. This is just a quick, like, 1 set, 2 set type of thing. Wider pull down. The utility of the wider pull down is that it will allow you to bias the shoulder extensors that are not the lats. If you do like a narrow grip thing, you're really allowing your shoulder girdle to shrug up, shrug down. Regardless of how you grip, wide, narrow, it's going to be a lot of lats. But if you grip wide, what you're essentially doing is you're limiting the range of motion to kind of the portion of the range where the shoulders are not going to be able to shrug as much unless you really intentionally do that, which I am not. So this is a great way to target the rear delts, the teres major, and some of the upper back because of how I'm leaning. Right, so a lot of people, I think, make the mistake of assuming that when they are underneath of a wide grip pull down, that they're actually pulling like this, like wide and into their sides from the pure frontal plane perspective. But really what's happening a lot of the time is there's this slight arch. And so you're actually pulling at a slightly forward to backward angle. And if you're pulling at a slightly forward to backward angle and your arm path is wide, guess what? That is rear delt city, upper back city, not really lats. So are lats involved in a wide grip pull down? Yes, you would be silly to suggest they aren't. But in the context of this kind of thing, I have an arch and I'm really just focused on moving my arm rather than my whole shoulder girdle. A lot of upper back here, minimal lats. All right, everyone, post lift drive. I wanted to talk about something, really relay to you all a conversation that I had with a good friend yesterday about volume and progression and this concept of recovery. So the main topic of the conversation was basically, my friend and I, we addressed this notion of maximum recoverable volume, which for those of you who don't know, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's basically the amount of volume that you can't recover from and progress on. And so I'm thinking about how a lot of times people will talk to me and they say, I was doing this amount of volume and I found that I couldn't recover, so I dropped it to this. And when people say they can't recover from something, what they're really saying is I can't progress, right? I can't add load, I can't add reps, I'm not seeing improvements in my physique. And when someone says that, my go-to assumption, okay, a couple of things. When someone says that kind of thing, like an exercise isn't progressing or I'm not progressing generally, and they attribute it to their lack of ability to recover, my first assumption is that they are not checking the biggest boxes, okay? So what are the biggest boxes? Sleep and nutrition are obvious ones that I don't think need explanation. If you're not sleeping and you're not eating well, you're not eating quality foods, you're gonna feel like shit, you're gonna be low energy, makes sense to me, right? So those two things aside, in terms of exercise specific big boxes to check, you want to make sure of a couple of things. Number one, the exercises that you're doing are quality exercises, which is to say that they're actually accomplishing the goals that you are you've set out trying to accomplish. So for example, if you're doing rows and all you're feeling are your forearms and your biceps, that's a shit execution. And the progression that you are missing in that context may just simply be a matter of the fact that you are not doing the exercise that is relatively appropriate to the goal, okay? So that's the first and most prominent thing that I see is people thinking that they're already doing their exercises well with good technique, when in reality they're not. So quality first, then worry about quantity, always. That's number one. Number two is people tend not to standardize things. And when I say they tend not to standardize things, I mean that they're not doing the same specific movements every week, or they're not doing the same kind of movements every week. So because of the nature of my life and the way that I like to train, I like to do different variations that principally are similar for you all. So as an example, today I did the dumbbell press, when if I were home, I might have done just like a cable press at the same angle, right? So there are many instances in my training where I'm not doing exactly the same movement, but principally I'm doing the exact same pattern, and so that's good enough for me. For many people, that might not work out well. They might be confused about how to set up the right angle. They might be confused about, why in this variation they're feeling so much more biceps, and in this other one they're feeling more triceps, right? So there are certain aspects of my training that I would not advise that you apply unless you feel very comfortable with all the exercises you're already doing. If you've not gotten to a point where you're super comfortable and confident in the motions that you're doing, then there's nothing to standardize or even worry about to begin with. If the execution is constantly changing, if when you add load, you're basically doing a different exercise or you're changing the tempo, right? Before you have gotten to the point of standardization, if you're worried about progression, then you're worried about the wrong thing. Again, this goes back to the exercise quality. If you're skipping over how you're doing your exercises and whether or not you can actually keep those things consistent, then you tracking sets and reps is totally fucking irrelevant, because you're just changing the thing that you're measuring every time you try to measure it. So a lot of times when people are worried about quote unquote recovery, it's because of poor exercise selection and execution, and then on top of that, poor standardization or lack of ability to standardize across weeks. So those two things, when you really pay attention to those two things, the progression honestly just kind of is almost like this emergent property that just occurs week to week when you're training hard. You don't really need to worry or think too much about it. It's just like, hey, this is the exercise that I'm doing. I know I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it repeatedly. And if I do it repeatedly, I train hard, I'm eating well enough, and I'm sleeping enough, then Jesus Christ, like, I don't need to worry about how fast I'm progressing or slow I'm progressing, because I know invariably it's going to happen at some point, and I don't really need to be overly concerned about the timeline. So that brings me to the final point of this, which is that when people are worried about recovery, they're typically worried about it on way too small of a timeline. People generally tend to think about progression on the scale of a week or even day to day, when in reality they should be worried about the scale of progression on a much, much longer timeline, i.e. at minimum like 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, even 16 weeks. By the time you get super, super advanced, if you're just basically honing in on the same exercises every single week, you should not expect to add load to those exercises, add reps to those exercises every single week. Your timeline of progression and how you view progression should essentially expand to the degree of advancement that you're at. And at a certain point, and elite powerlifters will tell you this first and foremost, they'll be lucky if they add, a fucking single rep to their progression, or, a single weight increment to their progression over the course of a whole mesocycle, right? So by the time you get to that extreme of using a high amount of load, then you're basically at a point where you're not even thinking about adding more load. You're just basically waiting for it to occur on a longer timeline. So in my estimation, regardless of the amount of volume you're doing, you shouldn't be worried about that until you standardize the quality of the exercise selection execution, you standardize the exercises to begin with, then you worry about the progression, and then you look at it on the largest time frame that you think is relevant to you, which again, at minimum is probably 8 weeks, and more like 10, 12, or 16, depending on your advancement level. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. Agree, disagree, let me know in the comments. And I'll see you all in the next video. Again, let me know if you have any questions about things you want me to answer in future videos like I did at the beginning of this one. See you all next time.